to our moderator, Shula Tas. Thank you, Sadaf, and welcome everyone at home. I'm very excited about my guest today. Layla Saad is an anti-racism educator and podcast host on the topics of race, identity, leadership, personal transformation, and social change. She is the author of the groundbreaking bestseller Me and White Supremacy, which is an anti-racism education workbook that was initially offered for free on Instagram and was downloaded by 100,000 people in 6 months. What struck me when reading this book, or I should say doing this book, is the way that Layla is able to explain how good intentions by well-meaning white people or people with white privilege will not necessarily lead to helpful behavior. It can, in fact, even lead to harmful behavior. And at the same time, Layla quotes people like Maya Angelou saying, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better." So, welcome, Layla. Thank you for joining us all the way from Qatar.
Thank you, Sheila, for having me, and thank you to Brainwash Digital for having me.
Can we start by telling us a bit about the moments leading up to you writing this book?
Yeah, this book is the third iteration of the Me and White Supremacy work, actually. It began as an Instagram challenge with me asking a question out of curiosity. I'd been talking to people who had white privilege about white supremacy and racism for about a year, and I had noticed a distinct shift in how people were being able to receive the conversation, being able to really self-examine. And I just wondered, what have they learned about themselves and white supremacy that makes the conversation now a bit easier? There's a lot less white fragility. There's a lot less tension. What's going on? And so I was thinking about this one night, lying asleep in bed or trying to fall asleep. And I grabbed my phone and I started writing that question. What have you learned about you and white supremacy? And then I think, well, what is white supremacy? It's such a big question to ask. And do people really understand what I mean when I say that? And so I began listing out these different components or these different aspects of white supremacy, things like tokenism, tone policing, white feminism, color blindness, anti-blackness, and so on and so forth. And suddenly I had dozens of these different aspects of white supremacy. And I realized very quickly, this isn't a single Instagram post. This is a series of posts asking people to really check in and ask themselves, what have I learned about myself and these aspects of white supremacy, the way they show up in my life? And so that very night, I put out a post and said, hey, we're going to start this challenge tomorrow. It's going to be a 28-day challenge. Notably, it was the full moon night. And so that's why I chose it to be 28 days. That's where that came from. I wanted it to be sort of following a lunar cycle. And the very next day I woke up and said, okay, we're doing this. And we started with day one. What have you learned about you and white privilege? And for each of the days, I would explain what the concept meant, examples of how it showed up, and then I would ask a series of reflective journaling questions. And I invited people to journal in the comments to really reflect on themselves, not to talk about other white people or things that they had observed, but really things about themselves. And we did that for a month. And so that's how Me and White Supremacy began, was actually a live conversation, people live journaling on Instagram. And it was something that I had never done before. It's something that I had never seen before. And we had thousands of people, joining in the challenge. So the Instagram challenge became a digital workbook, as you said. And then the digital workbook has now become an even more expanded physical hardcover book and ebook and audiobook that so many people around the world are working their way through.
Thank you. You talk about the shift you noticed, that more and more people were willing to engage. Can you talk about it a bit more? Can you what kind of shift was that, and what happened? for that shift to
Yeah,
occur?
so I think it's really important to note that the people that I was talking to, I had written an article called "I Need to Talk to Spiritual White Women About White Supremacy." That's actually the first ever public conversation I ever had about white supremacy and racism. So the people that I was speaking to were not self-identified racists, were not self-identified white supremacists. They were people who self-identified as progressive, liberal, spiritual. They would probably describe themselves as colorblind or not completely not racist, right? And so oftentimes those are the most challenging people to talk to about this issue because they cannot see it in themselves. It's something that's so abhorrent to them and something that they are unwilling to do the reflective work to see how they have been conditioned into society that is white supremacist. They benefit from white privilege because of white supremacy. And so that's where a lot of the resistance came up. So I would write posts about, white supremacy, and there would be a lot of pushback. There would be a lot of defensiveness, a lot of tears, especially from white women, a lot of saying, we should band together under the fight of feminism. That talking about race was divisive or talking about race was racist. And so those were kind of some of the things that were coming up a lot, and especially when it was a conversation that was directly towards white women or about the ways in which people who self-identified as spiritual or who wanted to change the world were not really looking at racism at all. There was a lot of defensiveness around that, which was very exhausting to me because it can often create a very emotionally violent response. And, like I said, racism and white supremacy isn't just like those people over there. Isn't just the people who proudly, are whites only. But it's also those who have it conditioned in the back of their mind, and it shows up in all of these other kind of often passive-aggressive or unconscious ways.
Yeah. You said in various ways, in various interviews, that it's not our responsibility, by our, I mean black people's responsibility, to educate white people about race and anti-racism and white supremacy. So what made you become an educator nonetheless? What made you change that attitude?
Yeah, what I will say about that for myself and my own journey is it was something that I was called to, but I tried to refuse the call several times because it is so emotionally challenging and laborious and heartbreaking and often very traumatizing. But I found myself returning to this work again and again and again. And I think it speaks to some of my really core ideals and core values, which is I've always wanted to do work which helps people, helps people's lives be better, helps the world be a better place. Before becoming an anti-racism educator, I was a life coach and a business coach. I was working with people who wanted to live their lives authentically, wanted to build authentic businesses, wanted to do work that helped change the world. So it was kind of a natural progression into this work. And I think that background really informs the way that I do my work as well. It has a very personal approach. It's very much about internal self-reflection. But I do say that about, this isn't our responsibility, because I think it's so important for people who have white privilege not to lean so much on Black people and people of color with the expectation that we should be teaching or that it is our burden or our duty to do so. There's so many people throughout history who have been doing this work. There are so many resources out there. And one of the things that I've often said in my work is that it's up to you to really curate your own curriculum around this, to really learn about what are the ways in which white supremacy has shaped society in ways that I'm not even aware of, right? And I think it's very important for people to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about white supremacy, right? I've said a couple of times already, it's not about the self-identified white supremacist, but it's about this idea that, or it's not just that, I should say, but white supremacy is this idea that people who are white or who look white are superior to people of other races, and therefore they deserve to dominate over those people. And domination has looked different throughout history, right? So throughout history, we've seen colonization, enslavement, genocide, land theft, all manner of physical and emotional violence. But domination can also be in interpersonal relationships too, right? Domination can be white saviorism, which is this concept of people with white privilege feeling like they need to save Black people from ourselves, you know, save us from ourselves, or save us from being Black in the circumstances that we live in. Domination in interpersonal relationships can look like tone policing, right? At work or at anywhere on the internet, at home, where, you know, as a Black woman, I often have had to face white people, often white women, telling me that if I were to just change my tone, say it in a nicer way, then maybe they might listen, right? And it really calls on those tropes of the angry Black woman, So domination can look different in different ways, but the key thing to remember, I think, is that white supremacy works at many levels. So it works at the personal and interpersonal levels, but it also works systemically and institutionally. It is everywhere. It is part of what is our normal, and that's why it's often so hard to see.
Yeah. Would you compare it to the construct of patriarchy?
Yeah, it's another ism, right? And so Bell Hooks has talked about and linking, often when she talks about white supremacy, she also links it to patriarchy, capitalism. We can link it to heteronormative you know, ways of being. They're all interlinked together.
So let's talk a bit about the book itself, because well, white supremacy, it's called Me and White Supremacy. So white supremacy is sort of the basic undertone of the book, I guess. It's the concept from which you start. It's the foundation, and you say you shouldn't you shouldn't read or listen to the book, but you should do the book. So expanding upon this concept of this foundation of white supremacy, you dive into different concepts. You mentioned some of them, like the white saviorism and token. No, you didn't say tokenism, but
tone policing.
Yeah, tone policing. Thank you. So you explain how concepts work, and then you ask people to do a journaling assignment. How did you come up with this method? What were your influences in building up this book?
I think, like I said, I think having a background in life coaching and personal growth work is really key to the way that I approach my work. I am naturally a very self-reflective person, and in the work that I was doing formally as a coach, one of the things that I was doing was encouraging people to self-reflect. But particularly as it relates to anti-racism work, what I noticed is that in that first year, that was very difficult, right? Having those conversations around race. I think what made it really difficult
2018, right? This first year you were talking about.
That was 2017 to 2018.
Yeah.
So in that first year, what made it more challenging, I think, is that it was me talking, you know, to white people and people with white privilege, but not a conversation back or a conversation that was within their own minds. When I flipped the question, instead of me saying, this is what you need to know about white supremacy, instead I asked them, tell me what you have learned about yourself and this. That's when a real shift began to take place, both for me as an educator and for the people who were engaging with my work. They were no longer just passively consuming knowledge, right? Not just passively consuming facts and information, but actually taking part in the transformation, which begins with self-reflection. Like I said a few minutes ago, white supremacy operates at different levels. I really believe that working at the personal level is so key to unlocking those other levels, because we can change systems, we can change laws, we can change policies, but if people's mindsets don't change because they haven't done their own internal work, they'll continue to just replay those same dynamics in many other ways. And we've seen that. If it was just about changing the laws, then when racial discrimination was legally abolished, we should have a post-racist society. And we don't, because the racism still exists in the mind, and it also then continues to be played out in other institutional and systemic ways. So that process of you tell me, you engage with it, you take responsibility for your work, right? Instead of thinking about this as something that you're doing to save Black people and people of color, or as an act of charity or philanthropy. Like, this is your responsibility. You have to dig in within yourself and really look at, like, peel back your memories and think about, when I was young, how was white supremacy present there, right? When I was in nursery, when I was in middle school, when I was in secondary school, when I got my first job, right? All of these scenarios, how did white supremacy influence those situations? How did your white privilege show up? How were other people impacted by your behaviors in ways that you maybe didn't consider until someone held up a mirror to you to look at it? That, I think, was really key in getting people to engage with the work in a deeper way.
So you, in a sense, you turn back the responsibility, you hand it back to white people, and go tell them, go self-reflect. And what do you hope comes after this self-reflection? What comes after the insight?
So information without a transformation is just, an intellectual exercise. And that's why I always say this is not a book that you read, it is a book that you do. Because as a consequence of doing this work, as a consequence of that self-reflection, there should be a transformation. Your behavior should be different. Your thoughts should be different. Your values should be different. The things that are now important to your priorities, right, should be different. And if they're not, then it's really it's really important to self-reflect on why not. Why hasn't this penetrated my heart? Why hasn't this broken me open? Why have I not wanted to change from this work? We want a society in which Black people especially can live in the freedom of their full dignity and their full humanity. We do not have that world yet. I know that this year in 2020, a lot of the news has been really focused on police brutality and these really overtly overtly violent, right, examples of racism that we can all identify, we can all see it. But racism infiltrates our lives at all levels all the time, and we are constantly navigating it, constantly thinking about ways to protect ourselves from it, or how are we going to have to combat it, right? And so we shouldn't have to live like that, right? It's this energy, which is so wasteful, that is focused on avoiding racism or dealing with racism, could be channeled into creativity, into art, into love, into so many other things that so many other people have access to because they're not having to fight against it. So that's really what I want, is for people to, I talk about this concept of being a good ancestor. I want people to feel called up and to think, I have a responsibility here. The way that I am, the way that I move through this world impacts people. What do I want that impact to be? And can I put myself out there in ways that I didn't before because my white privilege didn't need me to? How can I put myself out there to demand change, to create change, to facilitate change, to support change? Right? How can I do that? So that's what I want from this.
Thank you. Is there one of the exercises or days in the book? Do you have a personal favorite or one that is most meaningful to you?
I think there's 2 days that often stand out for me, just in terms of one is feedback from people who do the work. The other is just what it meant to me personally. The feedback that I always get from people who have white privilege is the day on white exceptionalism. That is the day that a lot of people always say to me, I felt really called out on that day. Like I really felt like you were talking to me. White exceptionalism is this idea that, I accept that racism exists. I accept that white supremacy exists, but I am not a part of that. I am the exception to this rule. though we may live in a society that has been shaped by white supremacy, I have somehow escaped that conditioning, and I am totally not racist. And they'll often, in their mind, have a running list of reasons why I couldn't possibly be racist. I voted a certain way. I have friends who look a certain way. I'm married to certain people. I have children who are a certain way. All of these reasons why I'm not, why I'm not racist. And so that's the day that people often get called out on. And I know several people have said on that day, I actually had to go back to day one because I was reading the book, not doing the book. And on that day, you said, if white exceptionalism is thinking that you can just read this book and not engage with this work because you're special. The other day, which is meaningful to me, and from a more painful perspective, is the day on you and Black women. So we do 3 days on anti-Blackness, you and Black women, you and Black men, and you and Black children. And within all of those categories are also included, gender non-conforming people, non-binary people as well. And the day on Black women for me, when we did the Instagram challenge, was the day that I cried. I broke down and cried. Up until that day, it's in the second week of the challenge. Up until that day, I had been okay. It was a lot. It was a lot to hold that space, but I hadn't cried. I hadn't really allowed what I had been reading from people to infiltrate inside of me. I was really just focused on, your job is to hold this container for people to do this work. But being a Black woman, that day for me was really hard. And I remember just feeling like the little Black girl inside of me, crying out and just thinking, why do they see us this way? And there were several things that I read on the comment threads, which I am glad that people were writing this stuff. It's ugly stuff, but I'm glad that they were digging in to write it because it means that they were engaging with sincerity. But there were certain examples that I read that were like, a woman said she had gone to the clinic and she was waiting to see the doctor. And when the doctor came out, she was a Black woman, and the woman's first sort of internal reaction was surprise and confusion. And in her mind, she spoke about how she realized that she just doesn't see Black women in positions of leadership. She just doesn't trust that a Black woman should be in a position of leadership, right? So there were certain things like that came up that were very painful to hear, especially because I know myself as a Black woman, I've had to work hard my entire life. And all the Black women in my life have been given the same messages. You're Black and you're a woman. You have all of these things working against you. You have to work so hard. And so to read things like that, where it's like, I'm not imagining it. It's real. Was both extremely painful, but also quite freeing at the same time, because I realized then I can just be who I am. I don't need to be who white supremacy thinks I should be. So those are the 2 days that often stand out for me. And I will say, especially just ending on this point of Black women, seeing the way that the Breonna Taylor case has been dealt with in the United States just drives home this message of Black women often being the most marginalized, discarded, undermined group in society. And it's just a reminder to me again and again why I do this work, because we don't deserve that. We deserve everything.
It must be extremely tiresome to be engaging in this all the time. You put yourself in this vulnerable position every day. Do you ever think about quitting?
Yeah, I have behind me, I don't know if you can see them, but I have I call them my literary ancestors or my literary grandmothers. And one of them is Audre Lorde. And when I'm feeling that feeling of vulnerability and tiredness and why am I even doing this, I often return to her book, Sister Outsider, her collection of essays. And, in reading some of those essays, especially the one called The Transformation of Silence into The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And she talks about, her famous quote, your silence will not protect you, right? And I realized in those times that I'm like, I don't want to do this. I'm like, but me not doing this doesn't protect me from not experiencing racism. It is not a protection to be silent. So as much as I may want to stay silent, I have a greater responsibility for my own self and to my daughter, to my friends, and to Black women and Black people around the world to engage with this work, because it's the work that I'm called to. That being said, though, I think it's really important to also heed her other advice, which is around self-care. And I really do treat self-care like it's my job, right? It is my job to take
What does
exquisite...
self-care look like for you?
It's so many things, right? So right now, where I am right now, self-care looks like unfollowing everyone on Instagram, spending less time on social media, spending more time in my life. At the moment, I'm really prioritizing exercise, sleep, quality time with my children, working with my team to help me maintain, boundaries, because I intend to live a life that is representative of my full dignity. I'm not going to wait until white supremacy is over to live the way that I believe I should be able to live, right? And so I have to treat self-care like it's the most important anti-racism tool that there is, because the world is not going to give it to me. The world is not going to grant it to me. So I have to give it to myself.
I want to go back to the book and place it more in a historical context, because it's not the first book on anti-racism. It won't be the last. You already dove a bit into the concept of white exceptionalism. In your book, you quote Martin Luther King from his letters from a Birmingham jail, and I wanted to make I wanted to quickly quote it as well, because it's so much connected to the present, I think. He in the letter he writes the following. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed by the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct actions. And this quote ends with, lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. How do you think the white moderates that he is talking about, how do they relate to the liberal progressives of today?
As you were reading that, I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the criticisms they get, right? And we've seen this year of unprecedented growth and recognition of that movement, but we also continue to see, I have seen a lot of criticism from people who may be described as white moderates who say, I agree white supremacy is wrong, I agree police brutality is wrong. However, the Black Lives Matter movement is also wrong, right? And so people who may be described as white moderates, white liberals may say, we do want Black people and people of color to have dignity, to have humanity, to have equity, but we don't want them to do it their way. We want to do it in a way that we approve of. We're fighting for our dignity, our humanity, our very life. It is not going to be a walk in the park, and there are times when it has to be revolutionary. In fact, the real progress has only been made by revolutionaries, right? And by revolutionary movements. And so the ways in which white supremacy manifests, yes, is by, like you said, the white citizens counselor, the Ku Klux Klaner, right? The white supremacists. Absolutely, they are they view white supremacy as the correct way that things should be, and they will fight to the death for it. But as much energy is put behind that, there is equally a lot of passive energy that is put behind maintaining white supremacy by either not getting involved and sort of putting their heads in the sand and saying, this isn't my issue, or actively working against progress by undermining our movements, undermining our leaders, undermining our methods, and basically saying, we will join you if it's the way that is right for us. And that really comes to one of the concepts in the book I talk about, which is white centering. And white centering is this view that a white-centered way of doing things is the norm, is the correct way.
Yeah.
And, right. And anything outside of that is wrong, is other, it's lesser than in some way. You know, this idea of what is civilized behavior, what is it to be civilized, is often from a white gaze, a white view. And so I think about, yes, we've seen incredible progress from when he was writing that letter to now when we're speaking, but there's also patterns of behavior that continue to be manifested by people who, like I said, will tell you hand on heart, I'm not a racist, right? But in other ways are really hindering movement forward.
Yeah. Would you say that these people are the hardest to reach, to convince, because they already because they have white exceptionalism, as you put it?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I don't know that it's harder than convincing a self-proclaimed white supremacist. But what I do know is that it's not as easy as you would think it would be, and that a lot of energy is actually invested in white supremacy by people who believe that they are not a part of white supremacy. A friend the other day said that they had suggested my book for somebody to read, and that person said, why are you suggesting this to me? I'm not a white supremacist, right? And so this distinction between that's something other, it's not me. Yes, you're not a white supremacist, but white supremacy is part of your life, it's part of your norm of behavior, and if you engage in a process such as me and white supremacy or any other process like this, what you'll discover very, very quickly is that you're actually very invested in white supremacy, in white privilege, in keeping the white norms that exist today.
I want to go to week 3 of your book. You devoted a whole week to allyship. Can you explain why? Why did you make that choice?
Well, I think that's a word that people are often, right? They're like, okay, I want to make change. I want to be an ally. And then they have an idea in their mind of what it means to be an ally. And so that week, actually, what I do a lot throughout that week is debunk some of the ideas of what you may think allyship looks like. You may think allyship means that you self-proclaim that you are an ally, right? That you reassure people that you're an ally, or you take some sort of performative action to show that you're an ally, such as posting a black square on Instagram when everybody was doing that blackout, or you know, wearing a certain thing, or you may be, you know, thinking that you're practicing allyship because you included more people of color on your website, or whatever it is, right? Those are surface behaviors that.
Some of the concepts you use are white centrism, tokenism, optical allyship. And being called out or in.
Right.
Let's go to this optical allyship, because probably some of the viewers who are watching us right now, they may have been posting black squares on their Instagram. What is wrong with that?
I don't think it's necessarily that there's something wrong with that behavior in itself, but if it is not backed up with consistent anti-racism work that is both internal and external, then what was it for other than to signal to other people that you are one of the good ones, right? That you are, you're the exception to the rule. It really becomes about making sure that other people know that you're good, which is another form of white supremacy, because it centers you as a white person as opposed to centering Black, Indigenous people of color, who your anti-racism work should be all about. That's who it's for, right? Even as you're even as you're doing the deep diving work, right? The digging up and answering the questions and all of that, the reason you're doing it is not for your own self-development. It's not for your own personal growth. It's so that Black people and people of color can live better. And so, optical allyship, like I said, the behaviors in themselves aren't intrinsically bad. It's just that when they lack any other context for anti-racism practice, then they are now a form of creating an optic of allyship, but not an actual practice of allyship.
So it's not enough.
That's what I want people. I want people to be able to really distinguish between, understanding that allyship is a practice. It's not a label that you can give yourself or that anyone can give you. It's an ongoing practice that, lasts us for a lifetime. I think people get so attached to the name and being identified as such that they forget why they're doing it in the first place.
Thank you. I want to go to an Instagram post you wrote on September 22nd. It says, coronavirus hasn't been the only dramatic curve we've seen this year. The bell curve of people who rushed into and then out of anti-racism learning, conversation and actions has steep curves too. We've seen a huge momentum in the last couple of months, and it's already in the decline as well. How do you look at that? What's your opinion on it? What does it do?
It's frustrating, to be honest with you, and at the same time, I really circle or sort of balance between having realistic expectations and understanding that many people who have white privilege are still very, very attached to white supremacy. And though this year may have been unprecedented in its growth of people's understanding of it, it doesn't mean that they're suddenly going to shift and commit to anti-racist practice. So there's that on one side of my brain. And then the other one is having a deep sense of hope and faith and those higher ideals that keep me in the work, right? Keep me showing back up for the work. So as I look at that bell curve of, we had George Floyd's murder, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. And we had that steep rise suddenly of anti-racism being everywhere and people wanting to really focus on Black Lives Matter. Every company having their Black Lives Matter statement. Every Black person and person of color suddenly being interviewed. But the steep rise, and then we've had this steady decline as well. It's my hope that as we have the rise, that there will be people who will stay in it, who were so woken up that they felt that they couldn't go back to sleep again, right? That there will be those people there, but also that understanding that there's still going to be that group of people that were just doing it because they didn't want other people to think that they were a bad person. They didn't want other people to think that they were racist. And that's been, if we look at the history of anti-Blackness and racism and civil rights movements, we've had that again and again and again, right? And so it's the long game. But I really want to sort of turn the mirror back to people who have white privilege and really ask them to look within themselves and question, why do we keep doing that? Right? Because if Black people and people of color have been in this fight, in this work consistently,
not by choice,
not by choice, consistently over generations, many people often having lost their lives as part of this movement, why are we not as committed, especially since we are the ones who created it, we are the ones who sustain it, we are the ones who benefit from it, and we are the only ones who can actually dismantle it. What is our responsibility?
Yeah. I read an interview where you compared the COVID crisis sort of to the anti-racism crisis or the momentum, that all of a sudden during COVID, all kinds of things were possible that weren't possible before. And you said, that is what I want to see happen with this, and this being the anti-racist movement.
Right.
What is needed to achieve this long-term goal? What is needed to anchor this knowledge, according to you?
It doesn't get anchored until people who have white privilege really see this fight as their fight, really see this work as their work. I and so many others can continue to put so much work out there. You know, there are so many incredible activists who are out on the streets doing so much. We can continue to show up, and we do, with so much energy and zeal and creativity and love. But until the majority who hold power also see this as their fight, which they are willing to do no matter what, then nothing shifts. So that's kind of like it's what makes this work so heartbreaking oftentimes, is because I and we can give our lives to it, but it doesn't mean that it changes. It doesn't change until a mass number of people say, yes, we take this on.
Yeah. Is that why you chose to dive or do this work and specifically focus on the individual versus the systemic level?
Yeah, I think that, and that's where my knowledge and expertise is. That's where my sort of skill set is. But also, yeah, I think that if it's not internalized, it's something that's valuable to me, it's important to me, I have to live my life this way. Until it gets to that, then people may be doing the optical allyship, right? And the performative actions, or nothing at all, and nothing changes. And we've seen, you know, I've been researching, I've been doing some research from the Young Readers edition of Me and White Supremacy. And one of the things that was really important to me was to look for examples of people who have white privilege, white people in history who, you know, really put themselves on the line, like really risked themselves. And there have been examples of that. So we know it's possible. It just needs to be a lot of people as opposed to a few individuals.
You mentioned already the Young Readers edition of White Supremacy Me. You're working on that. When is it coming out?
It's still a work in progress.
Yeah.
You know, I think COVID really changed everything for so many of us, and for me as a mother of two children, my children became my priority after they were sent home, you know, to learn from home. But it's something that, just as I did with the adult book, it's something that I really want to give my full attention to. There's an added layer of responsibility that I feel with the Young Readers edition. This is really, you know, kids' minds are so open to learning, right? And I don't just want to give them information. I also want to teach them a way of thinking, a critical way of thinking about the world, and a way of really taking that responsibility for this work. So yeah, it's still open-ended when that publishing date is going to be.
Yeah, and what's the state of the younger generation? Do they give you hope? Well, how is it going?
Yeah, I mean, I think the younger generation has always given us hope, right? Has always given, you know, over every generation. I'm thinking particularly about Rep. John Lewis, who passed away this year, and in studying his life and how from a very young age he took on this fight as if it were, you know, this is my life, this is what I am dedicated to, and all the sacrifices he made to have the world that we have today. I think young people are much more flexible in their understanding of themselves. Adults are very rigid in their self-identity, right? The brain develops and then it just hardens, and this is who we are now. I'm like this, and this is how I am, and this is how I see the world. Young people are still evolving who they are. They're open to ideas. So I think one of the really notable things about young people is there's less fragility, because they can open up to see, maybe I did something that I didn't realize was racist, right? But now I'm getting feedback that it was, so I can really reflect on that. It's harder to do that with adults.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so that must turn the conversations differently as well. Do you have different conversations with children? And what do you discuss with the children?
I talk a lot to my daughter's turned 11 actually this month, and we have been having conversations around race since she was probably around 6 years old. And you know, my son is 6, So he's there listening as well. He asked me yesterday, actually, I was telling my husband, he asked me yesterday, Mama, are we black or white? And it's really interesting, right? How kids don't have these like rigid understandings of things as we do. But my conversations with them really gets me to be discerning about how I talk about things as well. Because what I don't want to pass on to them is, I definitely want to tell them the truth. I want to be realistic. I want to prepare them for a world that is still anti-black. And I want them to be able to identify when something racist is happening to them and to say it and to stand up for themselves. But at the same time, I really want to tap into my own hope and tap into their hope and be able to leave room for, the freedom of our humanity, that we're not becoming identified with these messages that the world is trying to feed back to us. So I often balance out telling them the truth about the way the world is, very quickly followed up with, and that is a misunderstanding. Just because they treat black people like this doesn't mean that that's the correct way. And actually, this is all the beauty and wonder of who we are. So it's definitely, I have a number of online virtual classes. One of them is on parenting and white supremacy. And I talk to people about, it's different depending on, your parent who has white privilege. Are your kids white? Are they, biracial? Are they light-skinned kids of color? The way that you're going to have this conversation with them is going to be different for each one. But the important thing to remember is that it is an ongoing conversation. It is ongoing.
Yeah. You also have these ongoing conversations in the book circles, right?
Yeah, so I don't run the book circles, but I do encourage people to, in the back of Me and White Supremacy, there's an appendix that has a lot of guidance on how to do Me and White Supremacy using Me and White Supremacy circles, using a process called the Circle Way. But one of the other avenues that I do have ongoing conversations is my podcast, Good Ancestor Podcast, where I interview change makers, culture shapers, primarily, Black people and people of color who are doing work in the world right now. I see them as living ancestors who are shaping the world for us now and for future generations.
What is a good ancestor?
Oh, I think, that's definitely a question that I ask every guest that I interview. I want to know what their definition is of that. And I think it's up to each one of us. Like, we have the privilege and the responsibility for each one of us to identify what that is for us, so that we can live into that. But for me, it's about living my life in a way where I leave a legacy of healing and of liberation. That is what I want to leave behind, that when I'm gone, people can say, this is how she lived her life. And she created for us a legacy where we have more healing, we have more liberation because of the choices that she made.
Nice, thank you. Thank you very much. Do you see yourself being an anti-racism educator for the rest of your life, or do you hope that one day you'll be able to sit back, or you maybe just choose to sit back?
I think I don't just see myself as an anti-racist educator. I do see myself more broadly. I'm a teacher, I'm a podcast host, I'm a speaker. I'm somebody who's really interested in identity and in leadership. Personal leadership, in how we have conversations around race and justice. I believe I will continue to grow. I couldn't have imagined 5 years ago that I would be sitting here having this conversation with you. And so I like to remain open to wonder what could come. But at the same time, I also know that it is my vocation to do work that helps to make the world a better place. And something that will always be my focus and my priority is, how can I show up in ways that create healing and liberation for Black people especially? So that will always be a part of my work in some way. But I think it's so important for me personally not to box myself in to something that only exists because we have a world which is wrong. This world is wrong the way that it is set up.
Yeah.
I don't want to identify myself in that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I really enjoyed speaking to you, and I hope our viewers at home learned and will buy your book as well. So thank you very much. Layla Saad.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Layla Saad. Thank you, Shulatas. And of course, thank you for watching from home. If you want to rewatch or you missed part of the streams, the replay will be available in a few minutes on this platform. We also would like to hear your thoughts. Give us your feedback. Hit the survey button, which is now available on screen. And join us in about 30 minutes with widely admired sociologist Richard Sennett, and throughout the weekend we also have Samantha Power, Michael Sandel and Marta Nussbaum. So make sure to join us again. See you again.